Long before I ever saw the apartment, I told myself that Ashmere Heights would be the start of something new, something safe. I had spent 21 years learning how to disappear in my own home, tuning out my mother's criticism, my father's cold silences, and my brother's cruel laughter that always came when I tried to speak up. By the time I packed my suitcase, I wasn't running to something. I was running away. The building stood at the edge of Ashmere Hill, an old brick structure dulled by fog and years of rain. The narrow staircase creaked like it remembered every tenant who had come before me. My room smelled faintly of wood polish and something older, something that clung to the corners no matter how many windows I opened. The spare bedroom had a single crooked door, the closet. The knob wouldn't turn no matter how hard I twisted. The landlord, a man with gray hair and eyes like static, just shrugged. "Storage," he said. "Been sealed for years. Best leave it be." It didn't feel like storage. It felt like silence held behind wood. My new roommate Lillian arrived that evening. She was everything I wasn't: composed, confident, the kind of woman who seemed built from straight lines and unshakable calm. "It's fine," she said, brushing invisible dust off her sleeves. "Old buildings always have quirks. We'll make it home." That night, the fog pressed against the windows like something breathing. I lay in bed, trying to let the quiet soothe me. But beneath the hum of the radiator came another sound. Faint, almost apologetic. A soft scrape from the closet. Then another. I sat up, pulse hammering. "Lillian?" She mumbled something from her room, half asleep. I told myself it was just pipes, or the wind, or the building settling. I wanted to believe it. I'd spent years forcing myself not to believe what I heard. My parents' fights, my brother's jeers, my own heartbeat screaming that something was wrong. But the sound came again, slow and deliberate. And for the first time in years, I whispered into the dark, "Please stop." By the third week, the noises had names: scraping, tapping, and the soft rhythmic thud like a pulse under the floorboards. I told myself I was tired. I was working long shifts at the campus library, studying late, skipping meals. Exhaustion made the mind cruel. But every time I passed the closet, my eyes caught something in the brass knob. A faint vibration, like breath fogging on glass. Lillian didn't believe me. "Old pipes," she said, sipping her coffee. "You're hearing echoes. This place is practically vintage." "I'm not imagining it," I insisted. "The handle moves." "Then don't look at it," she said, smiling without warmth. That answer cut deep. It was the same tone my mother used when she told me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. One night, I wedged a chair under the knob just to be safe. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of it rattling. The chair vibrated. I froze, clutching my blanket like a shield. My phone sat inches away, but my fingers wouldn't move. The fear was heavy, familiar. It felt like being a child again, waiting for the shouting to stop on the other side of my bedroom wall. When morning came, the chair was still there, the knob, motionless. But something had changed. Objects began to shift. My sketchbook moved from desk to bed. The kitchen light flickered when I walked past. A cup of coffee I'd left untouched had a faint lipstick stain. Lillian's shade, though she swore she hadn't touched it. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I needed rest. Maybe the apartment was just old. But deep down, I recognized that feeling crawling up my spine. It wasn't just fear. It was memory, the kind that whispered, "No one's going to believe you." That night, I dreamed of a door that opened to nothing, and when I woke, my hand was resting on the closet knob. By December, the apartment no longer felt like a home. It felt like a test. Lillian kept her distance, leaving early, returning late. She started locking her door. I caught her watching me sometimes, her expression unreadable, her lips tight like she was holding something back. "You've been talking in your sleep," she said one morning. "What?" "You keep saying stop it over and over. Sometimes you laugh. It's unsettling." I laughed nervously. Guess I'm losing it. She didn't laugh back. That afternoon, I called my brother. I think something's wrong with the apartment, I said. He chuckled. Something's always wrong with you, Serafina. I'm serious. You always are. He hung up. That was the moment I realized fear is easier to live with than disbelief. At least fear keeps you company. The next night I heard it again. Scraping, whispering, a low thud. But this time, it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster and heard breathing. My knees buckled. "Lillian!" I shouted. She burst from her room, her hair tangled, eyes wide. "What the hell is going on?" "You hear it, right?" I gasped. We stood there, side by side, listening. For one horrible second there was silence, then a single sharp knock from inside the closet. Lillian turned pale. "We should call someone." "Who?" "The landlord, maybe." We called. No answer. We knocked on neighbors' doors. No one opened. The fog outside was so thick it erased the world. When we returned, the closet door stood open. Inside, a folded gray blanket and 2 coffee mugs that weren't ours. My breath caught. "What is this?" Lillian shook her head. "I don't know." But I saw her hand trembling. She was scared too. After that night, nothing in the apartment stayed still. The heater clicked in patterns like Morse code. The lights buzzed louder when I entered the room. Sometimes I'd see a shadow under the closet door when it was closed, thin, human-shaped, waiting. Lillian stopped speaking to me altogether. She spent most nights at her boyfriend's place. When she did come home, she'd glance at me like I was contagious. One evening, I overheard her on the phone. "She's not sleeping. I think she's having some kind of breakdown. She keeps talking to the walls." It took everything in me not to scream. Maybe I was losing it. But how do you prove you're sane when no one believes you? That night I sat on the floor with my sketchbook, drawing the closet over and over. Each sketch looked different. Sometimes it was a mouth, sometimes an eye, sometimes a mirror. I fell asleep there, pencil still in hand. When I woke, Lillian was standing over me. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "Trying to understand." She sighed. "Serafina, you need help. I need someone to believe me." Her voice cracked. "Maybe you're the only one keeping this alive." That hit harder than anything the closet could do, because deep down, I feared she was right. The night before I left Ashmere Heights, the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it. It wrapped the building in silence, swallowing the streetlights. Lillian had already moved out. She left a note that said only, "I hope you find peace." I stood alone in the living room, suitcase packed, sketchbook under my arm. My eyes drifted to the closet. The knob gleamed faintly in the dim light. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I was tired of running. I reached out and turned the handle. It opened easily. Inside, nothing but emptiness. A small, dust-lined space that smelled faintly of cedar and old rain. No mugs, no blanket, no shadow. I laughed. I laughed until I cried, until my knees gave out and my breath came in short, shaking bursts. There had never been anything there. Just echoes, just the parts of me that had never been heard. When I finally stood, I whispered, "I believe you," to the quiet space inside the closet. And for the first time, the silence felt kind. The things we bury never truly disappear. They wait for us in the dark until we're brave enough to face them. Sometimes the most haunting voices are our own, echoing from the closets we've built inside our minds. And the real freedom doesn't come from escaping what scares us, but from learning to listen to ourselves and to the silence that finally answers back. When Jasmine moved out, I thought the apartment would finally feel lighter. Empty. Mine. I'd been waiting for that moment, finally free from the tension of living with someone who never acknowledged your presence except to complain. I pictured myself curling up on the couch with a book, leaving the blinds open, drinking coffee in silence. I had imagined it for weeks. I found a new tenant through an online ad. Carla. She seemed perfect. Too calm, too polished. Like a person who'd been rehearsing her life to avoid mistakes. Rent on time, polite, courteous, never asking too many questions. At first, I let my guard down. I even smiled when she said good morning, imagining a normal coexistence for once. But old instincts die hard. Years of family chaos had trained me to observe and survive, to note what people did with their hands, how they lingered, what they avoided saying. My childhood was a theater of whispers and accusations. My father slamming doors when angered, my mother critiquing everything with surgical precision, siblings using silence like a weapon. Those lessons didn't fade when I left home. They stayed embedded in my nerves, always on alert. It took only a few days for Carla to awaken that old tension. At first, it was small things. Dishes in the sink that weren't mine, a faint scent of perfume I didn't recognize, books slightly shifted on the shelf. I chalked it up to stress. Maybe I'd misplaced them. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. But the feeling in my stomach wouldn't lie. Something wasn't right. It was the camera that revealed the truth. I had installed a small, cheap security camera in the living room, a habit left over from years of paranoia. Watching the footage made my blood run cold. Carla had been in my apartment at 1:30 a.m., moving quietly, rearranging drawers, lingering in corners. She didn't touch anything obviously valuable. She just existed in my space. The way she moved was casual, almost serene, but every step carried a claim. I confronted her the next morning, my voice barely steady. You moved out. Why are you here?" Her smile was soft, almost innocent. "I missed it," she said. No apology, no remorse, just calm, deliberate intrusion. I changed the locks immediately, but the sense of violation lingered. I could no longer relax in my own home. Every creak, every shadow made my heart leap. Carla had taught me that the scariest people aren't loud, aggressive, or grotesque. They are quiet, patient. They slide in unnoticed, leaving you questioning your perception of safety. Days bled into nights. I stopped staying at the apartment for more than a few hours at a time. Friends' couches became temporary refuges, and I began to notice how every sound felt like a threat. The wind brushing against the windows, the neighbors' footsteps upstairs. My mind interpreted everything as a signal. I started leaving cameras in more places almost obsessively. Kitchen, hallway, even the bedroom. Carla had shown me that my sense of control was an illusion. Even with locks, alarms, and precautions, my sanctuary had been invaded. One evening, I saw movement in the footage. Carla, or someone like her, was just standing there staring into the camera. Not a glance toward anything specific, just a presence, as if testing my reaction. My hands shook as I hit pause. The rational part of my brain told me I was imagining it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, hunted even in my own home. I began retracing steps from my childhood, recognizing patterns in my family's behavior mirrored in Carla. Silent entry, minor disturbances, calm smiles, testing boundaries, waiting for me to react. And I had reacted, not with courage but fear. I tried talking to neighbors. The woman next door, Mrs. Henderson, was nice enough, but her reassurance didn't reach me. "Everyone keeps to themselves," she said. "Maybe it's nothing." But I knew better. It wasn't nothing. It was someone learning how far they could push without being caught. I started leaving notes on doors, labeling personal items, even writing the time on the fridge to track movement. It was obsessive, yes, but the panic in my chest demanded action. Carla had opened a door I didn't know could be opened, into fear I thought I'd left behind. By the third week, my nights were consumed by watching the monitors, reviewing footage, memorizing every flicker of movement, every soft shadow. I became a student of intrusion, forced to learn the rhythms of paranoia, the calculus of being watched. I knew I had to face it, Avoidance only strengthens fear. So one afternoon, I waited for Carla at the apartment. Pretending to leave, I hid near the hallway, camera in hand, recording without her knowing. She arrived, keys in hand, humming softly. She walked through the living room, untouched by the camera, rearranging a stack of magazines just slightly, as if correcting a wrong only she could see. My chest tightened. "Carla," I said, finally stepping forward. She looked up slowly, calm, no trace of guilt. "I thought you might want to see the living room," she said, voice gentle, almost disarming. "Why are you here?" I demanded. "You don't live here anymore." She tilted her head, considering me. "I like it," she said simply. "It's comfortable. Familiar. Doesn't that make sense?" I wanted to scream, to shake her. But instead, I felt a cold realization. She didn't need to justify herself. The rules didn't apply to her. My personal space, my boundaries, my life, they were irrelevant. I called the police that night. They took a report, but there was little they could do. No forced entry. No clear intent beyond presence. The terror she invoked was invisible, a psychological violation, not a physical one. After the confrontation, I avoided the apartment entirely. I slept at friends' homes, at motels, anywhere I could feel safe. Even a walk outside brought anxiety. Someone might be watching. Every reflection, every shadow, was potentially Carla. I stopped trusting strangers easily. I stopped leaving personal items unattended. Grocery runs became calculated trips. Park close, move fast, check the surroundings. Each routine action carried a threat I had never imagined. Sleep became fractured. I dreamed of keys turning in locks, doors opening silently, footsteps pacing. My body carried tension I couldn't release, muscles tight, heart racing, mind always calculating. The apartment had been stolen from me, even when physically empty. I realized I had become the person I never wanted to be, hypervigilant, distrustful, haunted by the invisible. Carla had trained me, unwillingly, in the art of fear. Months passed. Carla didn't appear again, but her presence remained. I changed apartments, but the lessons traveled with me. Privacy is fragile. Trust is earned, not given. The world doesn't wait for trauma survivors to catch up. Danger is subtle, patient, and ordinary. Yet through all this, I began to reclaim myself. I learned to set boundaries firmly, to question situations calmly, and to trust my instincts without letting them consume me. Every lock, every camera, every careful glance became tools, not chains. I still check my doors. I still notice shadows. But now, I do so without terror, with awareness and respect for my own limits. I survived the intrusion. I survived the terror of the unseen. And in doing so, I realized that true safety comes not from avoiding fear, but from understanding and preparing for it. Trust is precious, privacy is sacred, and fear is a teacher. Danger often wears ordinary faces and moves silently through our lives, but awareness, instinct, and courage provide the tools to reclaim control. True strength comes from learning to live fully, even when the shadows linger. When my marriage ended, I told myself I'd finally escaped a life that had been quietly strangling me. Divorce wasn't liberation. It was survival. My ex-husband, Daniel, had this way of making every conversation feel like a test I was destined to fail. He didn't yell, didn't hit. He simply made me doubt my own mind. Every word I said was twisted. Every truth I spoke was somehow wrong. I began apologizing for things I hadn't done, feeling guilty for thoughts that weren't mine. When the papers were signed, I moved into a small 2-bedroom house at the edge of a quiet town called Linton Creek. It wasn't much. Peeling paint, squeaky floors, but it was mine. I could breathe again, or at least I wanted to. The rent was too high to manage alone, so I posted an ad for a roommate. I remember the morning Eric came to see the place. He stood on the porch, holding a grocery bag instead of luggage, smiling in this way that seemed rehearsed. "I really appreciate the chance," he said, his voice calm and almost too polite. He was clean-cut, soft-spoken, mid-30s, someone you'd never notice twice. The kind of man you'd feel safe around. We signed the lease that same afternoon. For the first few weeks, things were fine. Eric was tidy, quiet, respectful. He washed his dishes, paid rent early, even brought me coffee on weekends. I remember thinking, maybe good people still exist. After years of being accused of paranoia, I needed to believe in trust again. But small things started to feel off. I'd find the living room curtains drawn when I was sure I'd left them open. My bedroom door, always locked, sometimes sat just slightly ajar when I returned from work. I told myself it was exhaustion, my trauma replaying tricks. After all, Daniel had trained me to second-guess everything. Still, the air in the house started to change. It felt heavier at night, as though someone else's breathing shared the silence. The first night I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. I froze. Slow, deliberate steps, back and forth. I lay there holding my breath, eyes on the narrow crack under the door. A shadow drifted past. Twice. I wanted to believe it was the house settling, maybe Eric getting a glass of water, but the steps stopped right at my door and stayed there for nearly a minute. The sound of breathing, steady, calm, listening. I told myself not to move. If I stayed still, maybe it would pass. And when it finally did, I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Eric was making breakfast as if nothing had happened. "You look tired," he said, smiling faintly. "Rough night?" I hesitated. "Did you get up last night?" He looked confused, maybe amused. "No. Why? You hear something?" I studied his face, searching for any flicker of guilt. Nothing, just calm, bland politeness. "I thought I heard footsteps," I said carefully. He shrugged. "Old houses make weird noises." That was it. No defensiveness, no over-explaining, just dismissal. The same kind of quiet control Daniel had perfected, where you start to wonder if maybe it really was in your head. For a while, I tried to convince myself of that. But then I started noticing new details. My shampoo running out faster than usual, the faint smell of my perfume in the hallway, though I only wore it when I went out. A hairbrush moved slightly from where I'd left it. Tiny, intimate signs that someone had been close. One night I stayed late at work just to test something. When I came home, the lamp in my room was on. I hadn't turned it on that morning. Eric was sitting on the couch reading. "You get off early?" he asked, eyes never lifting from his book. "No," I said slowly. "Just wanted to come home." He nodded. "I made extra pasta if you're hungry." His tone was warm, almost brotherly, but his eyes didn't match. They were too still, too controlled. That night I locked my bedroom door for the first time. I told myself it was a precaution, nothing more. But locking the door didn't make the feeling go away. It only made the silence louder. Then came the muddy footprints, one morning, leading straight to my bed. My stomach turned cold. I called the locksmith that afternoon and changed the locks without telling Eric. That night, he knocked softly on my door. "I noticed the locks are new," he said through the wood. "Yeah," I replied. "Needed an upgrade." A long pause. Then, in a voice almost tender, "Good. Safety is important." When his footsteps faded, I sat awake till dawn, staring at the door, wishing I had the strength to leave. I needed evidence, something tangible to prove I wasn't losing my mind. So I bought a cheap motion sensor camera from a hardware store and set it up in the corner of my room facing the door. I told myself I was being smart, not paranoid. That first night I barely slept. Every creak made my pulse jump. But morning came quietly. The camera light blinked red, recording done. I made coffee before watching the footage, convincing myself it would be empty, that I'd overreacted again. When the video loaded, I almost dropped my mug. At 2:47 a.m., my bedroom door opened. Slowly, Eric stood in the doorway, motionless, watching me. He didn't move for 20 minutes. Then he smiled, barely, and left. I replayed it 3 times before my body caught up with my brain. I felt sick, violated. My skin crawled. That evening, I confronted him. "Eric," I said, holding my phone like a weapon. "We need to talk." He looked up from his notebook. "Sure." I hit play. The video played in silence except for the faint hum of the house. He didn't blink. When the clip ended, he simply said, "You walk loud too." For a second, I thought I misheard. But no. He smiled slightly like it was a shared secret. "You walk loud too," he repeated softly, then turned back to his writing. Something in me broke. I locked myself in my room, shaking, replaying his words in my head. That whisper, so casual, so intimate, felt like a violation worse than any physical harm, because it meant he didn't just invade my space, he enjoyed it. I called the police the next morning. They took my statement, copied the video, and said they'd look into it. But days passed with no update. Eric still lived there, still moved through the house like nothing had changed. He started leaving notes on the fridge. "Please remember to wash your cup. Don't forget to lock the door." Each note written in perfect, tidy handwriting. A mockery of civility. Sometimes he'd hum outside my room at night, a low, tuneless sound that made my stomach twist. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. My hands trembled constantly. When the police finally searched his storage unit, what they found turned my fear into nausea. Hundreds of photos, me sleeping, cooking, reading, taken through cracks in the door, windows, even the vents, my toothbrush, my shoes, my bed. The officer said, "He's been watching you for months." They arrested him that afternoon, but the damage was done. That night I stayed at a hotel. I thought the silence would comfort me, but instead, it roared. Every sound felt like a footstep, every flicker of light like someone watching. Even after they told me Eric would be facing charges, I couldn't stop checking corners, mirrors, doors. My body refused to believe safety existed anymore, because it wasn't just Eric. It was Daniel. It was my father. It was every man who had taught me that silence was safer than speaking. Months later, I moved into a new apartment in another city. The windows faced the street, full of noise and light. No more darkness pressing in. I told myself this time would be different, but habits die hard. I still check the locks twice. Still sleep with my phone recording. Still wake at 3 a.m., heart pounding, waiting for footsteps that never come. Therapy helps, a little. My therapist says trauma lives in the body, that even when the danger is gone, your nerves don't know the difference. Sometimes I dream of Eric's voice, that whisper. "You walk loud, too." Other times I dream of Daniel saying, "You're overreacting." They blend together until I can't tell which fear belongs to which man. But there's progress. I've started talking back to the shadows. "Not this time," I say out loud when my mind starts spinning. "You don't get to live here anymore." It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. And I think that's what healing looks like. Not forgetting, but surviving in spite of memory. Fear doesn't always come from monsters in the dark. Sometimes it comes from people who smile while taking your power piece by piece. But survival isn't silence. It's learning to speak even when your voice shakes. Because the real horror isn't being watched. It's believing you deserve to be. When I moved to the city, I was searching for stability, a quiet corner of life where I could finally breathe. I had spent years under my parents' strict scrutiny, where mistakes were never forgiven and love always came with strings. My father, a rigid surgeon, measured worth in precision and success, and my mother wielded perfection like a weapon. My siblings thrived in that environment, but I learned early to hide my panic, to perform flawlessly, to stay silent when the world felt like it was scrutinizing me. Those lessons became survival tools, though I never realized how vulnerable they made me to others until much later. So when I found the apartment on the third floor of a modest brick building in a quieter part of town, I thought I had found my sanctuary. It wasn't much: a small living room with peeling paint, a kitchen that smelled faintly of damp wood, and 2 bedrooms separated by a thin wall. But it was mine. And I wasn't alone. My roommate, Theo, was a medical student who had impressed me with his intelligence and calm demeanor over our initial phone call. From the first week, Theo's presence was almost soothing. He was quiet in the mornings, meticulous with his routines, and polite in our conversations. We shared meals occasionally, often talking about human behavior, psychology, and medical curiosities. He seemed harmless, intellectual, almost charming. But there was something subtle that unsettled me. An intensity behind his eyes, a precision that didn't belong to casual study. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, leftover caution from years of parental oversight. I like to observe people quietly, to notice without being noticed. Perhaps I was simply projecting my own habits onto him. It wasn't until the second week that small oddities started to appear. At first they were minor. A sour smell in the kitchen, dishes left out longer than normal, milk curdled at the back of the fridge. When I mentioned it, Theo smiled calmly and said, "I'm conducting a personal study on the body's natural bacteria levels. It's completely harmless." I laughed nervously, though a sliver of unease settled in my chest. Later, I noticed his notebooks, full of meticulously drawn charts, observations, and lists about daily routines, meals, and reactions to various stimuli. I told myself he was ambitious, perhaps even brilliant. But when I found jars of hair collected from the bathroom drain and labeled by day, fear finally rooted itself in me. It wasn't just the hair. My toothbrush disappeared for a day and returned in a plastic bag labeled Day 14, Sample Collected. The room that had been my sanctuary now felt like a laboratory, and I was its unwitting subject. Every movement I made, every sound, even my hesitation when speaking, felt catalogued and scrutinized. Childhood memories I had buried, my mother's critique, my father's silent judgment, the sharp glances from my siblings, flared back at me, magnified 1,000-fold. When I confronted Theo, my voice shook despite my careful control. Why are you doing this?" He smiled, unnervingly calm, almost triumphant. "To understand human behavior. You consented the moment you moved here." A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't joking. And suddenly the lessons of my childhood, the constant performance, the silent observation, made sense in a new, terrifying way. I had survived years of subtle psychological testing at home, but Theo had taken it further. He didn't see boundaries, didn't see empathy, only observation and measurement. That night, I lay awake in my small bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, wondering how someone could be so calm while violating trust so completely. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't stay. The apartment that had promised freedom now held only fear. I spent the next morning packing quietly, leaving half my belongings behind. My hands trembled as I stacked clothes into a bag, carefully avoiding contact with anything that might be part of Theo's study. Every corner of the apartment seemed to breathe around me, a silent observer. As I packed, I tried to rationalize the situation. I wasn't imagining things. The jars, the notes, the toothbrush, these weren't pranks or quirks. This was deliberate. And yet, I felt trapped by the psychological weight of it. Theo had managed to touch the deepest nerve from my childhood, the part of me trained to comply, to hide panic, to suppress reaction. A week earlier, I had jokingly mentioned to a friend about moving in with someone like a mad scientist, and she laughed. I wanted to laugh now too, but the humor was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of violation. I remembered the night I first saw the labeled jars and realized he had been watching me for days, perhaps weeks, before I even noticed. The thought of how much he knew, the subtle changes in my expression, the brief flickers of hesitation, the way I fidgeted when anxious, made my stomach churn. He had studied me the way a biologist studies a specimen under a microscope. I was not a roommate. I was an experiment. When I confronted him, he had not even flinched. His smile was calm, patient, and he spoke with certainty. "You consented," he said. It echoed in my mind. Consent. Had I really consented by simply existing in his presence? The ambiguity was unbearable. I thought back to my childhood. My mother measuring success in numbers, grades, and behaviors. My father correcting every misstep, often in silence. Theo had mirrored that upbringing in its most terrifying form, without the familial love to soften it. This was pure observation, pure testing, stripped of compassion. By midday, I had loaded enough belongings into a borrowed car to leave immediately. Theo watched me pack, his expression unreadable, almost clinical. I avoided his gaze. Every glance, every reaction was being noted, and the thought made me feel both vulnerable and infuriated. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a surge of relief, but also a lingering terror. The apartment was empty now, but the traces of observation lingered like a ghost. My toothbrush, my personal routines, even my sleep patterns had been invaded. I drove to a friend's apartment without speaking, heart pounding, hands white on the steering wheel. Later that week, I saw Theo on a local news segment. His experiments at the university had led to his expulsion. He had been performing hygiene deprivation studies without consent. I felt a mix of relief and vindication, but also a creeping fear. My instincts had been right all along, yet the trauma remained, etched into my psyche. Even after moving out, the shadow of Theo's presence lingered. I couldn't stop checking my toothbrush, my personal items, my small apartment's locks. My home, once a refuge, now felt fragile. Every creak, every unexpected sound triggered memories of observation, of silent measurement. I avoided roommates, even close friends, for months. At work, I found myself watching everyone too carefully, analyzing subtle cues as though I were defending against another Theo. Paranoia had settled in, quiet but persistent. The lesson from my childhood, watch, comply, hide panic, had been resurrected, magnified, and now directed at a world that had no interest in my childhood traumas. Months later, I began therapy. I spoke openly about my childhood, about Theo, about the cumulative effect of living under constant observation. My therapist helped me separate instinct from fear, reality from lingering trauma. I realized that my sensitivity had kept me alive, that my instincts had been right. And yet, I had to learn to reclaim trust, to rebuild my sense of safety. A year later, I moved into a new apartment. Locks were reinforced, cameras installed, but most importantly, I reclaimed my routines and privacy. Theo's shadow remained a cautionary presence in my mind, but I learned that vigilance could coexist with normalcy. I allowed small trust back into my life, letting people close, but carefully, cautiously. I had survived, and the lesson was clear. Boundaries exist for a reason, trust must be earned, and fear, while natural, should not rule life forever. The story of Theo taught me that fear is often silent, subtle, and rooted in observation rather than overt aggression. True safety comes from recognizing boundaries, trusting instincts, and valuing consent and privacy. Trauma may linger, but awareness, vigilance, and self-respect are the tools to reclaim control over one's life. When I moved to Greystone Hollow, I thought I was finally starting over. The city smelled like wet pavement and coal dust, a mix of history and decay that clung to your clothes. I had gotten into a graduate program for psychology, a field that, ironically, I chose to understand people like my parents. My mother's silences were weapons, my father's tempers were storms, and I spent my childhood walking a tightrope between them. I learned early that the safest thing a person could do was stay quiet, stay small, and hope no one noticed. The apartment at Greystone Hollow was small but charming. Arched windows, creaky wooden floors, an ancient radiator that groaned like it was alive. I rented it with a man named Evan, another student, quiet and polite to the point of discomfort. His hair was always perfectly combed, his shirts crisp even when wrinkled. He smiled when spoken to but never asked questions, and his door was always locked, even when he was home. At first I respected it. After years of suffocating emotional exposure, privacy felt sacred. Maybe he just valued boundaries the way I did. But that feeling began to change the longer we lived together. It started with small things. My leftovers went missing. The milk carton would be nearly empty when I'd swear I hadn't used it. Then there were the sounds, soft, muffled voices in the middle of the night, laughter that seemed to come from the walls, the shower turning on at 3 a.m. when the house was supposed to be empty. I told myself it was the old plumbing, maybe thin walls, maybe the neighbors. But when you've grown up gaslit by the people who should have protected you, you stop trusting even your own senses. I didn't say anything to Evan. I just watched. Then came the smell. It started faint, like damp fabric. Within a week it became something worse, sweet and rotten, clinging to the hallway outside his locked door. Every time I passed, my stomach turned. When I finally asked him about it, he didn't look up from his desk. "It's probably the pipes," he said simply. "The building's old." I nodded, pretending to accept that, but something in his tone, too casual, too dismissive, made my chest tighten. I told myself not to push. I had learned long ago that confrontation never brought safety. But 2 nights later I heard it again. Footsteps above me, pacing. The ceiling creaked, dust sifting down. I stared up into the dark, my heart racing, and realized there was no second floor above our apartment. Only the crawl space. The smell grew worse over the next week. I could taste it in the air like spoiled meat. Evan barely came out of his room anymore. I'd hear his door click open late at night, soft movements, and sometimes, just before dawn, the faint hiss of a lighter, a quiet whispering voice. I started eating out more, spending longer at the university library, but even there I felt uneasy. My phone would buzz with blank messages, no sender, no text, just static. When I mentioned it to a classmate, she laughed. "Maybe your roommate's a ghost," she joked. That night, I dreamed someone was standing at the end of my bed, whispering my name. When I woke, my door was open. That was when I decided to act. The next day, when Evan left for class, I called the building maintenance office. My voice shook as I explained that there was a strong odor coming from the locked room. The man on the phone sighed. "Not the first complaint from that unit," he said. An hour later, 2 maintenance workers arrived with a key. I stood in the hallway, arms folded tightly across my chest, heart pounding as they turned the knob. The door opened easily. Inside there was no bed, no dresser, no clothes. Just a mattress on the floor surrounded by piles of empty food containers, a portable stove, and plastic bottles filled with water. Against the wall was a wooden panel, slightly ajar. Behind it, a small opening leading into the crawl space. The air was rank. My throat burned. One of the workers pulled out his flashlight and leaned in. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "There's another mattress up here." Something inside me froze. That night I sat on the couch, trembling. Evan didn't come home. The landlord called me the next morning, voice tight. "Your roommate's been evicted. Don't worry, he won't be coming back." But that didn't make the apartment feel safer. If anything, it felt worse, like something had been disturbed and left unfinished. Days passed. I tried to move on, to study, to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still there. Every creak in the ceiling made me jump. Every draft from the vent felt like breath. The landlord had locked the crawl space, but I still caught faint sounds at night. Shifting, scraping. I told myself it was rats, or wind, or stress. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, I came home to find the window above the couch open. I never opened it. There were muddy handprints on the sill, faint but visible, My body went cold. I called the police, but they found nothing. Old buildings attract drifters, the officer said, half apologetic. Just keep your windows locked. That night I slept on the floor by the door with a kitchen knife in my hand. When I told my mother about it over the phone, she sighed. You always overreact, Natalie. You need to stop imagining danger everywhere. It was the same tone she'd used when I was a child, when I told her about the noises in my closet, about Dad's quiet rages behind closed doors. I hung up before she could finish her sentence. I was done being told I was imagining things. A week later, while I was sketching by the window, I heard it again. A thud above me, followed by a faint cough. My pen fell from my hand. The landlord had changed the locks. The crawl space was supposed to be sealed. I climbed onto a chair and pressed my ear to the ceiling. Silence. Then another thud, closer this time. I called the landlord immediately. He didn't answer. I texted, "There's someone up there." No reply. Finally, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed onto the counter to reach the ceiling hatch. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the light. The latch came undone easily, as though it had never been locked at all. When I pushed the panel open, a gust of cold, foul air hit me, and there it was, the second mattress, filthy and torn, with piles of trash beside it. The smell was unbearable. No one was there, but the bedding was still warm. That was the last night I spent in that apartment. I moved out the next morning. The landlord refunded part of my deposit and avoided eye contact. He said the police had found signs of unauthorized occupancy in several crawl spaces across the building. No one knew for sure how many people had been living there, moving through walls and vents like ghosts of the forgotten. Months later, in my new apartment across town, I still wake at 3 a.m. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes I swear I hear movement in the vents. But the truth is, what haunts me most isn't the thought of someone living above me. It's the part of me that didn't speak up sooner. The part that learned silence from childhood and carried it into adulthood. I check locks twice now. I sleep with my shoes by the bed. I listen. Because I've learned that danger doesn't always knock. Sometimes it moves in quietly, eats your food, breathes your air, and waits for you to convince yourself it isn't real. Sometimes the walls we build for protection become the ones that trap us. Ignoring fear doesn't make it disappear. It only gives it space to grow. And in a world full of hidden rooms and quiet dangers, believing yourself is the first act of survival. When I first moved to Chicago, I told myself I was starting over. No more walking on eggshells. No more rooms that felt like interrogation chambers. No more pretending not to hear the way my mother's voice could cut glass, or my father's silence could flatten my chest. I was 24, fresh out of college, with one suitcase, a second-hand laptop, and a job offer that barely covered rent. But that didn't matter. I just wanted peace. The Craigslist ad read, "Room available, $600 a month, quiet neighborhood, no pets, no drama." It sounded like exactly what I needed. The man renting it out was named Vince. Mid-30s, calm voice on the phone, even offered to pick me up from the train station. When I first met him, he looked ordinary. Plain black hoodie, jeans, a short beard. The kind of guy you'd forget walking past on the street. That felt safe to me. Ordinary felt safe. The apartment itself was neat. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, open living space, lots of plants. I asked about the previous tenant, and Vince just said, she moved out suddenly, had family stuff. I didn't think much of it. I was too busy convincing myself that this was my reset button. The first few weeks were fine. Vince worked nights as a freelance investigator, or so he said. He paid rent in cash envelopes, cooked sometimes, and mostly kept to himself. When he was around, he was polite, borderline overly polite, always asking, "You feel safe here?" Or, "Everything okay with the locks?" It felt caring at first. After a childhood where no one asked how I felt, it was nice to be seen. Until the night I found the camera. It was late, I couldn't sleep. My ceiling light flickered. I stood on a chair to twist the bulb. and saw the faint red dot inside the smoke detector. I froze. A camera lens, tiny, hidden, pointed directly at my bed. I climbed down slowly, hands shaking. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't even his. But the next morning when I asked, "Hey, what's with the camera and the detector?" Vince didn't even flinch. He just said calmly, "It's for safety. Buildings had break-ins." "Then why is it in my room?" I asked. He smiled. "You can't be too careful." That's when something inside me, something old, the part of me that remembered every time I'd been gaslit as a kid, started to hum with warning. But I told myself not to overreact. I couldn't afford to move again, and I wanted to believe that I wasn't in danger. The longer I stayed, the smaller the apartment felt. I started noticing things, drawers slightly open when I swore I'd closed them, messages on my phone that disappeared before I could reread them, a faint smell of cologne in my room when I came home early. Every time I brought something up, Vince had an answer ready. "You must have imagined it," he'd say softly. "You've been stressed lately. You know, trauma can make people see patterns that aren't there." He said those words like he cared, like he was helping me see reason. And I hated that it worked. Then came the laundry incident. I caught him one evening standing near the washing machine, holding one of my shirts, just holding it, like he was studying the fabric. He looked up and smiled. "Some stains tell stories, you know?" "What does that even mean?" I asked, my voice tight. He shrugged. "Just an observation." That night I locked my bedroom door for the first time. The next morning the lock was broken. I started eating out more, staying at work late, pretending everything was fine. But the paranoia clung to me like smoke. One evening I came home to find my laptop open, my emails all unread. "I was updating your antivirus," Vince said. "You really should thank me." "Don't touch my stuff," I snapped. His expression hardened for the first time. "I'm trying to protect you," he said, voice low. "Someone's stalking you online." My stomach turned cold. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, phone in hand. "They've been watching you, sending messages. You think I don't see what they're doing? I'm the only one keeping you safe." I backed away slowly. "Show me the messages." He didn't. He just stared, eyes calm, voice steady. "You wouldn't understand." That night I barely slept. Every creak sounded like footsteps, every shadow like him standing at my door. I started planning my escape. I waited until he left for work. I packed quietly, just essentials, cash, and my laptop. But before I could reach the door, my phone buzzed. "Vince. You're leaving, aren't you?" My blood went cold. Cameras. There had to be more of them. I didn't respond. I just ran. Halfway down the stairwell, I heard his footsteps behind me. Calm, measured, like he wasn't even trying to hide. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not the enemy." I kept running. The street outside felt like freedom, until I realized I didn't have anywhere to go. No family I trusted, no friends who wouldn't call me dramatic. So I checked into a cheap motel and shut my phone off. 2 days later, a detective called from a blocked number. "Miss, you rented a room from a man named Vincent Hale." My voice barely worked. "Yes. We've been investigating him for digital crimes, extortion, surveillance, identity theft. You might want to come in." At the station, they showed me photos of other tenants, women, all smiling in rooms that looked just like mine, all secretly filmed, all stalked. My stomach turned when I saw the file names. Client 01, Client 02. He'd been selling everything. They arrested Vince that week. I watched the news clip on my phone. Private investigator arrested for stalking and exploiting tenants. His mugshot looked almost peaceful, like a man who thought he'd done nothing wrong. The detective said I was lucky. Lucky I left when I did. Lucky my instincts kicked in. Lucky I had proof. But lucky didn't stop the nightmares. For months, Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red glow of that hidden camera. I stopped trusting phones, mirrors, locks, anything. I tried therapy, but sitting in front of another stranger felt impossible. Every question sounded like control. Every gentle voice sounded like manipulation. It took a long time to realize that what scared me most wasn't Vince. It was how much of him reminded me of my past. The calm voice, the gaslighting, the way he made me doubt myself. Vince wasn't my first ghost. He was just the one that finally showed his face. A year later, I live in a different apartment, smaller, but mine. I still double-check the smoke detector. I still avoid Craigslist. I still hesitate before answering unknown numbers. But I'm learning. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting. It's about learning which voices not to believe. Last week, my therapist asked, "Do you trust yourself now?" I thought about it. I thought about how my childhood taught me to doubt every instinct, every emotion, how it took a stranger's obsession to prove that my fear wasn't weakness. It was survival. "I'm getting there," I told her, "and that's enough." Outside, the Chicago wind cut through my jacket, sharp and cold but alive. I looked up at the sky, gray, restless, endless, and for the first time in years I didn't feel small. I just felt present. Watching, yes, but also watching over myself. Trust is powerful, but it can be dangerous when we give it to the wrong people. True safety begins not with walls or cameras, but with listening to our instincts, especially when others try to silence them. We are taught to be polite, to dismiss our fear, to doubt our inner voice. But that voice is often the first and only warning we get. Believe yourself. Because sometimes, survival is simply the act of trusting your own truth. When I first moved into the studio apartment on Davenport Hollow, I thought I was prepared for solitude. I had grown up in a home where silence was punishment and noise was power. My father's booming lectures, my mother's cold withdrawals, and my siblings' petty betrayals taught me to hide, observe, and fear. Independence had always seemed like a dream, somewhere I could exist without judgment or scrutiny. The apartment itself was modest, barely more than a box with a kitchenette and a bathroom. But I loved it. The windows overlooked a quiet street, and the small size made it easy to clean and maintain. I was ready for a fresh start. Trevor entered my life the day I signed the lease. He appeared calm, collected, and disturbingly self-assured. From the first handshake, I noticed his eyes, too sharp, almost predatory in their attention. He claimed he didn't need sleep. I laughed it off, thinking it was a joke, some quirky boast from a college kid pushing boundaries. But that evening he remained upright well past midnight, staring at the walls, earbuds in, eyes unfocused but alert. I approached him cautiously. "Trevor, seriously, you're going to collapse if you keep doing this." He tilted his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "Sleep is a weakness," he said softly. "That's when people are easiest to get to." I froze. There was no threat in his voice, only observation. But the way he said it made my chest tighten. My instincts screamed that this was a man who saw fear as a variable to measure. At first, I tried to normalize his habits. Maybe he was a night owl, a student with peculiar methods, someone who thrived on odd schedules. But I quickly realized it wasn't that simple. He didn't sleep. Ever. He would sit in the dark, motionless, sometimes humming quietly or scribbling in notebooks, and yet he noticed everything. How I breathed, how I shifted in my chair, how my eyes flicked to the door whenever the floorboards creaked. I became hyper-aware of my own behavior. Every movement I made seemed to be cataloged. Nights became unbearable. I would wake at 3 a.m. to find him crouched in a corner staring at me. I left lights on to signal boundaries, but it only seemed to amuse him, perhaps even challenge him. One night, I woke to a whisper inches from my ear. "You shouldn't sleep so much," he said softly, grinning. "It makes things easier." I bolted out of bed, heart pounding. barely remembering to grab my phone before fleeing. Trevor didn't follow. He didn't need to. The fear was already planted. The days after that night were worse than the encounter itself. I became a ghost in my own home. I tiptoed around the apartment, measured every gesture, and avoided sitting where he could see me. Conversations with him became tense, mechanical. "Can you maybe go to your room?" I asked cautiously one evening, trying to maintain a semblance of politeness. "Why?" he replied without emotion. "I'm just observing." I clenched my fists, remembering all those years of watching my father's face for signs of disapproval, my mother's eyes for silent withdrawal, my siblings' smirks when I stumbled. Trevor was like all of them, distilled into one unnerving figure. But unlike my family, I had no escape plan. He began subtle manipulations. Lights were slightly dimmed when I returned home. My coffee cup was moved an inch to the left. He hummed certain patterns at unpredictable times. The environment itself became a psychological trap, a constant reminder that I was never alone in my home. I tried talking to friends seeking reassurance. "He's just weird," one said. "He probably doesn't even realize he scares you." But I knew better. My instincts screamed that this was intentional. The presence of someone who never rested, who existed in the shadows observing silently, was unlike anything I had experienced, even in the volatile environment of my childhood. The turning point came when I noticed my toothbrush missing, then returned wrapped in a napkin with small notes scribbled on it. Day 3, reaction logged. My stomach lurched. This wasn't harmless eccentricity. This was an experiment, and I was the subject. By the 3rd week, I couldn't breathe in my own apartment. Every creak, every faint sound sent spikes of adrenaline through me. Trevor was always awake, always watching, and I began calculating his movements before I even walked into a room. One evening, I confronted him directly. "Trevor, what you're doing, it's not normal. You can't just watch people like this. You're violating boundaries." He smiled, calm, unnerving. "Boundaries exist to be tested. Fear is useful. It teaches. You should be grateful for the lesson." Grateful. The word hit me like a punch. This was my life he was turning into an experiment. The lessons of my childhood, silent observation, controlled panic, measured reactions, had prepared me for discipline, not predation. That night I packed hurriedly. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into a bag. My heart raced, not just with fear, but with the adrenaline of finally reclaiming control. I left most of my possessions behind, knowing that the apartment had been compromised and that my presence had fueled his study. When I returned 2 days later, the studio was empty. Trevor had vanished completely, leaving no trace, no bed, no clothing, no notebooks. It was as though he had never existed. The experience mirrored patterns from my childhood: absence used as a tool, silence wielded to instill anxiety, and unpredictability shaping behavior. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had simply left. But the uncertainty gnawed at me. Every shadow, every whisper in a quiet room became a potential observation. The trauma of being watched, of having my private life cataloged, lingered. Even months later, I found myself checking corners before sleeping, listening for sounds that weren't there, imagining eyes on me in every reflective surface. The lessons from my childhood, hyper-awareness, vigilance, had been amplified by an adult predator who mirrored the psychological patterns I had learned to survive. Time slowly helped, but only partially. Therapy and support from friends allowed me to process the fear, separating realistic threats from lingering paranoia. I moved into a new apartment, one where I could control my environment. Locks were reinforced, blinds replaced, routines adjusted. Yet I carried the memory of Trevor, of sleepless observation, of calculated fear, as a permanent caution. I learned that survival is not just physical, it's psychological. Awareness, vigilance, and boundaries are not weaknesses. They are tools to navigate a world where some people exploit others' vulnerabilities. The experience left a mark, yes, but also a lesson. Fear can exist silently, without a shout or a strike. The true terror is observation, the quiet invasion of trust. And surviving it requires not only fleeing, but learning to reclaim one's life with eyes open, instincts sharpened, and boundaries uncompromising. Fear doesn't always announce itself. Some threats are silent, subtle, and reflective of our own vulnerabilities. Trust instincts, protect boundaries, and value consent and privacy. Survival is not only escaping danger, it's reclaiming control over one's mind, space, and life. Back in my sophomore year, I thought Mallory was my best friend, the person who would always have my back. High school had forged our bond, two girls who shared secrets, playlists, and dreams of escaping to somewhere bigger. Rooming together in college seemed like a natural step, a continuation of that friendship, a bubble of trust I thought would protect me from the wider, harsher world. I grew up learning to navigate conditional love. My mother celebrated achievement but never affection. My father's anger was sudden and punishing, his silence worse than his shouts. My older sister thrived on subtle manipulation, leaving me to question my own instincts. Over time, I became a master of hiding hurt, swallowing fears, camouflaging vulnerability. College was supposed to be different. With Mallory, I allowed myself the illusion of safety. The first month was easy. We decorated the apartment together, shared groceries, binge-watched shows until late. I felt like I had found a corner of the world where I could finally breathe. Then I started dating. David, Mallory's ex. At first, it was innocent. Light flirting, long walks, coffee at the campus cafe. I assumed Mallory would see it as harmless. I was naive. Small disruptions began almost imperceptibly. A note on my desk. Nice choice. Written in a familiar hand but dripping with sarcasm. My phone would vanish for hours. When returned, it smelled faintly of perfume or had messages opened that I hadn't touched. Coffee spilled across my notes, by accident. I brushed them off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But paranoia grows when trust fractures, and soon the fractures were undeniable. One evening, I came home to find my textbooks arranged differently. A photo of me, asleep at my desk, slid neatly onto the table. My chest tightened, memories of childhood intrusions flashing through my mind. Doors opening when I slept, whispers just beyond my hearing. My sanctuary had been violated again, this time by someone I trusted. I confronted Mallory in the kitchen. My hands shook as I held up my phone, showing the screenshots posted online. "You took something from me," she said, her voice calm, almost clinical. "So I'm taking everything from you." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That night, when I lay in bed listening to the city hum beyond my window, I realized friendship could be a thin, dangerous veneer. Mallory had weaponized my vulnerabilities, exploiting patterns I had assumed only existed in my family. By the second month, the intimidation escalated. My car tires were slashed one morning outside the apartment. At first, I refused to connect it to Mallory. Denial is a convenient blanket. But the screenshots and her earlier threats were pieces of a puzzle I couldn't ignore. Fear began to seep into mundane routines, checking over my shoulder, triple-locking doors, retracing paths through campus to see if anyone had followed me. Mallory began leaving subtle reminders of her presence. My favorite coffee mug would appear on her side of the counter. Notes scrawled in my handwriting style would show up in my backpack. I started leaving things deliberately out of place, setting traps to see if they would be touched, and almost immediately my suspicions were confirmed. The psychological toll was heavier than any physical damage. I avoided my own apartment. Friends began noticing my jitteriness. "Are you okay?" one would ask. I couldn't explain it fully, how someone I trusted could dismantle my sense of safety so completely, how every step outside the apartment now felt like a negotiation with potential danger. The breaking point came late one night. I had dozed off on the couch, and when I woke, my bedroom door was cracked open, the lock tampered with. On the pillow lay a single photo of me sleeping. Every instinct screamed betrayal. Every childhood memory of being watched and punished surged forward. I had never felt this small, this exposed, this violated. The next day, I went to the police. I explained everything: the notes, the social media posts, the car vandalism, the broken locks. They took my statement seriously, but cautioned that proving intent could be difficult. Mallory denied everything, claiming jealousy and misunderstanding. But forensic evidence, fingerprints, photos, time-stamped screenshots, left no doubt. I waited outside my apartment for her arrival, heart hammering. When she stepped onto the porch, casual, smiling, she had a smug, almost victorious air. I held up the notebook I'd been keeping, the evidence meticulously documented. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, voice trembling. Her eyes glinted, cold and unrepentant. "Because it's fun," she said. "Because you thought you were safe. You should never assume someone else has your back." She was expelled from school, but the psychological damage lingered far longer than any disciplinary action could fix. I had learned that safety is fragile, and trust, especially trust extended to someone close, is a double-edged sword. I moved out of the apartment and changed routines, yet fear shadowed me like a second skin. Even in a new dorm, I double-checked locks, watched doors, questioned every casual gesture from new acquaintances. I documented unusual events in a notebook, a ritual that helped calm my panic but never fully erased the anxiety. Sleep was fractured. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper in the hall triggered a flashback. I began noticing patterns in others' behavior, small signs of manipulation or intrusion, and sometimes I reacted too quickly, calling friends unnecessarily, checking rooms twice, asking strangers questions that seemed odd. Yet each precaution reminded me that vigilance had saved me from further harm. I still saw Mallory in my mind, not physically, but as a cautionary figure, a representation of how easily trust can be exploited. Her actions had taught me an indelible lesson. The people closest to you can cause the deepest wounds. Months turned into years. The trauma faded, but lessons remained. I cultivated caution without letting fear dictate life. Friendships became more selective. I asked questions before trusting, observed before confiding. My apartment, once a trap, became a sanctuary again because I reasserted control. Locks, alarms, habits, but also mindset. I learned that safety is both physical and psychological. Sometimes I still pause before leaving for class, glance at the door, and feel a faint echo of the past. But now, I recognize it as awareness, not terror. The betrayal had shaped me, yes, but it had also strengthened me. I live cautiously, hyper-aware, but not paralyzed. The scars remain, reminders of how close trust and danger can coexist, but also of how resilience and vigilance can reclaim what was threatened. Betrayal can come from the people we trust most, exploiting vulnerabilities we thought were hidden. True safety and peace are not guaranteed, but they can be reclaimed through awareness, careful boundaries, and resilience. Trust wisely, but fear thoughtfully, and let experience guide, not dominate your life. I used to think silence was safety. Growing up, noise meant danger. Shouting slammed doors, my mother's cutting voice slicing through the house like a blade. She called it discipline, but really it was control. Every mistake I made, no matter how small, became a weapon she'd use later. If I forgot to wash a dish, I was lazy. If I questioned her tone, I was ungrateful. So I learned to stay quiet, to apologize before I was even accused. When I finally moved out at 26, it felt like I was stepping into air that didn't belong to me. The world felt too loud, too unstructured. I didn't know how to exist without someone watching, waiting for me to fail. I spent 2 years bouncing between tiny apartments and short-term roommates, always trying to find something that felt like peace. But peace was expensive, and loneliness was cheaper. That's when I found Maddie. through a housing app. Her message popped up on a Thursday afternoon. "Hey, I saw your listing. I'm looking for a quiet place, low drama. I'm super tidy and pay rent on time. Let me know if you're still looking." Something about the way she wrote, simple, friendly, unpretentious, made me respond right away. She showed up the next day to look at the place. She was maybe my age, late 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair, and a smile that made you feel like you'd known her before. She carried a canvas tote and wore an oversized sweater that looked lived in. I remember thinking, she feels safe. She moved in 2 days later. The first week was easy. She was polite, kept her space clean, and even cooked dinner one night. Pasta with a creamy sauce she said she learned from her grandmother. We stayed up late, eating on the couch, talking about everything and nothing. She asked about my family, and when I said, "It's complicated," she didn't push. Just nodded and said, "Yeah, I get that." For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. 3 months passed like a soft blur. Maddie was easy to live with. She paid her share of bills early, watered my dying plants, and left me little notes on the fridge. Grabbed more milk, or "Don't forget your lunch." She was funny in small ways. She'd dance around the kitchen with a wooden spoon as her mic, or sit on the porch in her pajama pants, sipping coffee and narrating the neighborhood gossip like we were in a sitcom. One night she said, "You know, you're different. Most people keep walls up. You just trust." I laughed awkwardly. "That's probably not a good thing." She smiled. "It's rare. Don't lose that." We became close, not best friends, but something warm and easy. I told her about my mother, about how I'd never really learned how to relax. She listened without judgment. Then one weekend she said she was visiting her family upstate. She packed a small duffel, hugged me goodbye, and promised to be back by Tuesday. Tuesday came and went. By Friday I started to worry. I texted her. No reply. I called. Straight to voicemail. I checked her Instagram. The account was gone. By Sunday I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked on her door. Silence. My hands were shaking as I turned the knob. Her room was empty. Completely empty. No clothes. No toiletries. Even the bedding was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Had she moved out without telling me? Why? Then I noticed something. A small cardboard box under her bed. Inside were fake IDs, printed screenshots of social media profiles, and a copy of my driver's license. I sat on her floor, numb, flipping through the contents of the box. There were ID cards under different names: Madeline Graves, Elena Ward, Hannah Collins, each with her photo, slightly altered hair, different birthdays. There were documents, bills, addresses, credit applications. And there, among them, was my information, my name, my number, my address. A chill ran through me so deep I could hear my pulse. I whispered, "Who the hell are you, Maddie?" I took everything to the police station the next morning. The officer on duty listened, nodding, jotting things down on a clipboard. When I showed him the fake IDs, his brows furrowed. "Looks like identity theft," he said. "You did the right thing coming here." They ran her name, Madison Hale, the name she'd given me, and nothing came up. It was a ghost identity. Days turned into weeks. They couldn't trace her. Every alias led to another dead end. One detective finally said, "Whoever she is, she's done this before. People like that, they reinvent themselves. New names, new cities, hard to catch." I changed my locks, closed my bank accounts. For weeks I slept with the light on. At night, I'd hear phantom footsteps, creaks that sounded too deliberate. I'd wake up and swear I smelled her perfume, that faint vanilla scent she always wore. Every noise felt like a warning. Months passed and I tried to rebuild my routine. I started therapy, trying to untangle the fear Maddie left behind. My therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Green, said something that stuck with me. "She didn't just steal your information, she stole your sense of safety. You need to reclaim that." But it wasn't easy. I started getting mail addressed to Madeline Graves, credit card offers, insurance letters, even a hospital bill. Each one felt like a ghost note, reminding me she still existed somewhere, maybe even watching. I called the bank to flag the accounts, but deep down, I knew she was still out there, wearing someone else's name. One night I dreamed she came back. She was sitting at our kitchen table, smiling. "You missed me," she said. "You needed me to teach you this." I woke up sweating. After that, I started checking locks 3 times before bed. I deleted my social media. I even moved to a new apartment across town, smaller, older, but quiet. Sometimes I'd think I saw her face in crowds, at the grocery store, at the bus stop. A familiar tilt of the head, a flash of auburn hair. My heart would leap, but when I looked again, it was never her. Still, the fear never fully left. It just learned how to sit quietly beside me. Years later, I can finally talk about it without shaking. I've rebuilt, cautiously, new friends, new boundaries. When people ask why I live alone, I just say, I prefer it that way. Sometimes, I reread the police report. They never found her. No trace, no closure. Just an open file and a name that never existed. I used to think Maddie was evil, a calculated manipulator who saw me as an easy mark. But the truth is, she was something worse. A mirror. She reflected every weakness I'd carried from childhood, my need to please, to trust too soon, to believe that kindness meant safety. My mother used to say, "You have to see people for what they are, not what you hope they'll be." I used to think that was her bitterness talking. Now I know it was her experience, because the truth is, Maddie wore the same kind of mask my mother did, the one that says, "You can trust me." And I wanted to believe it so badly that I didn't look closer. Even now, when I hear laughter from another apartment or smell that faint vanilla scent in a store, a part of me tenses. But I've learned something powerful. Vigilance doesn't mean fear, it means survival. When we give it too easily, it becomes currency for those who trade in deception. But when we learn to balance openness with awareness, we protect both our hearts and our sanity. Maddie taught me that evil doesn't always break down the door. Sometimes it's the person who holds it open with a smile.